What you're seeing here is a clip from John Carpenter's 1985 film They Live, where the character on screen has discovered a set of very unusual glasses which allows him to see things that he otherwise wouldn't. In a way, what we're seeing here is kind of an analogy for ideological analysis. In other words, ideological analysis asks you to explore the way that our everyday seeing is loaded with ideas that reproduce themselves through various forms, like advertising, movies, and so on. So to put on your ideological glasses allows you to see those myths and ideas and to be able to talk about them in a more intelligent manner. So what we're going to do in the remainder of this video is to look at some aspects of ideological media creating ways of thinking, ways of seeing that we generally take for granted, that we generally don't pay much attention to. And this seems to me a good place to begin. So I want to begin by introducing a couple of other terms into the mix here. And the first is myth, as in mythologies. And I want us to think about that as more than stories about ancient Greeks and Romans and so forth, but rather as something that's ongoing, something that we deal with today. And it has to do with the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves about power. And it's not just the stories we tell ourselves, it's the stories that are told to us about who has power. And when it comes to power, it's still the case that the demographic group most likely to have power would be white, upper middle class men, say between the ages of 35 and 80. And of course, that's not to say that things aren't changing, things aren't in flux. There are multiple voices in culture going on at the same time. It just so happens that there are dominant voices in the culture that work more powerfully and are heard more often. And it's the culture industry, as it's called, which produces a good number of these voices. It tells these stories by television shows, in advertisements, films, books, etc., and end up either legitimizing those in power or taking them to task. Because all this is going on all the time in our culture, and because we're a part of that discussion, it often seems to us as though this is natural. The way things are is the way they ought to be. It's difficult to put those glasses on and to begin to try to see things a bit differently. Part of the power of myth is that it does seem invisible. It does seem to be natural. It's also the case, however, that today the cultural debate has really been foregrounded, and so that it's almost difficult to avoid a heated discussion about the various components of power that we were looking at a moment ago, race, class, gender, and so on. But in any case, to kind of move away from today's situation, I want to go back in time and look to the end of World War II and move through the 50s and 60s to get a sense of how gender played out during that particular time. Particularly the mythologizing of women. And this is a poster from World War II when women were being called upon to work in factories and join the military and so forth. So taking a departure from the roles that they had had up until that point. And so you can see in advertisements of the period that there would be a kind of naturalizing. This would begin to appear more natural because we would see these images more and more frequently. This is another ad that the government had constructed to try to get women to work in the factories. And so various images of women being empowered, as this famous image did and continues to do from World War II. We can do it. This idea of the woman as the bearer of power, as rather than being subservient. But it's after World War II ended and men began coming back from the war and were looking to be employed, and women seemed to be having a good number of the jobs that men wanted, that we began to see this kind of flux in advertising and in other media appear that would denigrate women to a certain extent and remind us, and I'm putting remind us in quotes, where a woman ought in quotes to be. And so you would begin to see ads like this one that would generate a sort of anxiety. Married, no reason to neglect stockings. And you can see the man looking down at this woman's stockings. This is kind of like the antidote to we can do it. This is we can do it, kinda. You mean a woman can open it? This is a ketchup bottle. This ad, so the harder a wife works, the cuter she looks. Notice where work is. Work has been delegated to the home. The woman has got a duster. She's dressed in an apron, and the little box tells us, gosh, honey, you seem to thrive on cooking, cleaning, and dusting, and then all tuckered out by closing time. What's the answer? And it's vitamins, darling. I always get my vitamins. This sort of image would reappear through different media, the woman as a happy housewife, in different forms. So you would get television shows like Father Knows Best and Make Room for Daddy, and where woman was often the quiet housewife, the happy quiet housewife who would do the work silently. Of course, for those who didn't, there was always the potential for punishment. Again, we have another image of a woman falling in love with a product. Tide's got what women want, turning housework into something that has got this heavily emotional component. Two of the archetypal images that appeared during the actually 40s, 50s, and 60s, but even more strongly in the 50s, was of the cowboy and of the princess. And here we have Sonny Boy dressed as a cowboy, and of course the rugged individual quality of the cowboy is a myth that we would get time and time again. And Westerns were particularly alive with television at this period. There were just a whole slew of Westerns. But also, again, the housewife as being kind of crowned the queen of the home and enjoying herself almost in this kind of daze of ecstasy as she moves through a color-coordinated kitchen. But it's also interesting that this, at the same period, this kind of despair with what was going on at home for housewives began to become kind of clear in the advertisements for pharmaceuticals. This is an advertisement for Dexamil, and as you can see, it's an antidepressant, an early antidepressant. And you can also see, I think, that the goal of the antidepressant is not only to ease the depression rather, but to get the woman happily back at housework. This is another ad from the same period. Now she can cope thanks to Butasol. And here you see a woman who's literally tied to a stove oven range by her presumable daughter, who is dressed interestingly, and this goes back to the myth of the West, the cowboy, the Indian, in quotation marks, a Native American, who's, of course, a white daughter of the white woman. Here's an ad for yet another antidepressant. You can't set her free, but you can help her feel less anxious. And you can see this woman behind what looks like bars, right? Made up of mops and brooms and irons and brushes and so forth. Those conditions are not seen as a problem. It's the reaction to these conditions to help her feel less anxious, fixing that anxiety, but not the conditions that provoke it. It's interesting, too, that this same period of time would turn the work that housewives were expected to do into play. kind of a training ground for girls, some would say. This is a page from a Montgomery Ward catalog from the period, and you can see you have a vanity set for the girl, an ironing board, the whole range of equipment needed to make meals and clean the dishes from the meals and do the wash and vacuum up the house afterwards. And so kind of diminishing the status of the work the housewife does by turning it in play. Another branch of the culture industry, and you could include toy manufacturers with that, would be, of course, movies. And in 1958, Attack of the 50-Foot Woman came out, and the implications of both the ad and the movie are pretty clear, that if the woman gets too big, she becomes a monster. Conversely, when a man gets too small, as seems to have been an issue not only with horror films of the day and science fiction films, but with film noir of the time, that becomes a problem as well. During this period of time, you would see a whole slew of women as monsters, which was kind of unique to the 50s and 60s. It was very rare that women would be monsters before the 1950s. And here you have ones like the she-creature, the she-devil, the astounding she-monster, and the wasp woman. Again, the way culture, industry speaks to the idea of gender in the changing landscape of the United States in post-World War II. So, I'll leave you with this from the early 1960s.
Your coffee, sir.
Thanks, beautiful.
You're welcome.
How can such a pretty wife make such bad coffee?
I heard that. Darling, it's our anniversary. Why so glum?
Nothing. Well, it's your coffee.
Again? Even today?
Honey, your coffee just doesn't taste any good.
It must have been such a nice vacation. Did you ever see Larry looking so happy?
Well, honey, happiness is a vacation. Away from your coffee.
Forget the coffee, Marge. It's never very good.
But Phil,
I'll get some at the plant.
Harold, is the coffee all right?
Mm-mm.
You mean it's as bad as yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
No improvement at all?
Mm-mm.
Harold, don't just shake your head. You've got to tell me what's wrong with the coffee.
Bad taste.
Attention, ladies, please.